Welcome back to Chess Dog. Today we have a brilliant game between Magnus Carlsen and Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa from the Julius Baer Cup. And yes, this is the same day that he had a bit of a controversial resignation against Hans Niemann, but you can get that information elsewhere. We're going to look at this brilliancy between these two amazing players. Praggnanandhaa had white, Carlsen had black. Let's jump right in. E4 was played by Pragg, G6, D4, D6, Knight C3, Bishop G7, and Bishop to E3. The basic attacking idea here for white is to play Queen to D2, trade off the dark squared bishops, and play H4, H5, just like the Yugoslav attack in a dragon, same basic motif. A6 was played by Magnus, the idea he could perhaps expand on the queen side, and now H4. Immediately launching the pawn, not wasting time. Since this knight is still on G8 and no longer does not currently cover this square, this move is trying to be played before the knight comes out. But now the knight comes, and it appears as if Magnus has comfortable control over the H5 square. But in fact, after H5, Pragg already has an advantage out of the opening, and Magnus was beginning to sweat. And you could see that because they had the visual of the players while the game was being played. Knight H5, Rook H5, pawn takes, queen takes. So white's given up an entire exchange, a rook for a knight, yet he has a clear advantage already. His lead in development and pressure on this king side is enormous. So this sacrifice by Pragg is very powerful. Now, computers say the best idea for black is to play something like C5, but Carlsen was already worried. So he plays the move E6. Essentially, what he's trying to do is hunker down, get his pieces out, and get his king to the queen side as quickly as he possibly can, because he knows his king side is in big trouble. E5 was played by Pragg, D5, locking up the structure, creating a sort of a French defense-like structure in the middle of the board. Castle's long, now C5, putting some pressure on the base of the pawn chain and allowing the queen to get out. Pawn takes, bishop to D7, and F4. This pawn could advance to F5, but it also could support a knight going to F3 and G5 later. Knight to C6, knight to F3, and queen to A5. So Magnus has cleared the back rank, and his king can castle on the queen side. The only problem with the king going to the queen side is that this F7 pawn will lose its only defender. And so that's the real challenge here. So Pragg plays knight to G5. The knight and the queen both aim at F7, and Magnus says, you know what? I'm in enough trouble. You can have the pawn. I'm going to move my king to the queen side and just get out of there. And there's a little bit of a trap here. If in this position Pragg takes on F7 with the knight, then bishop to E8 causes him some trouble. The knight is pinned to the queen, and the rook backs up a potential D4 push later. But Pragg does not do that. He does take the F7 pawn, but with the queen. And now he's attacking the G7 bishop and also this E6 pawn. And here, there was basically only one move that Magnus could play to survive this position, just one, and he did play it. The move is D4. This is the move that allows him to sort of escape from his troubles. The bishop takes, the knight takes, and the queen takes on G7, and now knight to F5. Hits the queen, and Pragg still has an advantage, but Magnus is beginning to fight back and has a bit more of a playable position with a safer king. By the way, if you're enjoying this content, be sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and the bell notification for further videos. So after knight F5, hitting the queen, queen to F7, getting away from that attack, rook H to F8, Carlsen hits the queen again, now queen to H5. Now in this position, queen takes C5 was a fairly strong idea. After queen to E2, queen to E3 check would have gotten queens off of the board, and this is what the computers liked. But white is still better here in this endgame, but that was something Carlsen could have done. Instead, he played knight to E3, hitting the rook and the bishop. And here, just like Carlsen had an only move a couple of moves ago with that D4, here Pragg has an only move, and it's a hard move to see, and it was an amazing decision. Praggnanandhaa plays rook takes D7. He sacrifices a second exchange. So now he's given up both of his rooks for minor pieces. That's a pretty big material deficit. Really an amazing decision in a tough situation. Rook takes d7, but now knight takes e6. And that's why this sacrifice of the exchange works. Now these two pawns here are monsters, the ones on e5 and f4. And this knight just radiates power in every direction, hits the rook at f8, defends the pawn at c5 for the present moment. So a very powerful sacrifice. The rook goes to g8, and it's amazing how many of these are only moves in the computer analysis while the game was going on. Bishop to d3 blocks black's access to d1 and also aims at the h7 pawn. Knight to d5. He wants to put pressure on this c3 knight, get it off of the board, and maybe open up his king. And Pragg goes ahead and takes on d5. Now that allows Magnus to force queens off the board. With queen to e1 check, Pragg has to interpose with his own queen, and now queens are off the board, and rook takes knight. So here's our imbalance. Pragg has given up two rooks, but in exchange, he has the two minor pieces and four pawns. So he has quite a bit of compensation, but one of those pawns falls off now after king to e2, rook takes g2 check, king to f3, rook to h2. And now, in this moment, Pragg has a chance to make a crushing move. But understand, this was played at 15 minutes with a 10-second increment, so the time was getting low, so it's hard to find the right moves. The move he should have played was this move, king to e4, hitting this rook at d5. And let's say rook to d7, one of the options, then f5, and these pawns are just way too strong for Magnus. After rook h4 check, the king just moves back, and computers give white like +6, like a 6-pawn advantage here, and multiple ways of winning, so he doesn't have to find only moves. Pragg would definitely win this position. But instead he plays king to g3, and I think he was trying to set up a situation where the rook is at h1 and bishop to e4 would fork the two rooks, but that actually wouldn't work. If he plays rook to h1, excuse me, bishop to e4, then rook to g1 check, king f2, and rook d to d1 would save the rook, although white still has a strong endgame here. But after king to g3, Magnus plays rook to h6, and knight goes to g5. Obviously, he's attacking the knight on e6. The knight goes back to g5. Rook takes pawn, so he's regained one of those pawns. Now it's two minor pieces and two pawns for two rooks, but again, these pawns are so strong. Knight takes h7, king to d7, and here Pragg makes an inexact move, and this move allows black to get back into this situation, back into the game. He plays knight to f6, and what Carlsen does is he plays rook takes f6. He gives one of the exchanges back to create a more manageable endgame. After ef6, king up, king f3, king f6, king to e3. So here we have material balance, a bishop and two pawns versus a king and rook, and one of those pawns is passed. So there is some potential winning chances for white. So let's see if Magnus can defend this position. Of course, he's the best endgame player probably that has ever lived, and his defense in the endgame is impeccable. So let's see how he handles it. First, he plays a5. He wants to put these pawns on a5 and b6 out of the reach of the light-squared bishop. As long as they're on dark squares, the bishop cannot attack them. Pragg centralizes his king. The rook goes to h5. So what Magnus wants to do is just keep his rook on the 5th rank. Just keep it here until white advances this pawn, and then he will change his strategy. So Pragg immediately does that. Plays f5, obviously defended by the bishop. The rook goes to h6, king to d5, and now king to e7. He's creating, again, a barrier that the king at d5 cannot cross. That's his strategy. Now a4. Pragg wants to create a wall of light square power here. Rook to c6 and b3. Here we are. These three pawns, this bishop and this pawn, means that basically white can't lose. He's the only one that really has winning chances here. He can always hold this position together, and black really can't break through. King to f6, king to d4, king to e7. Now, bishop to e4 hits the rook, rook to c7, and here Pragg plays king to e5. And after rook to c5 check, bishop to d5. He's giving up this c-pawn so that he has a chance to advance this pawn. The rook on c6 controlled the f6 square. The pawn couldn't move forward. But by giving up that pawn, now he can advance his f-pawn. Rook to c2, f6 check, king to d7, bishop to b7, grabbing the pawn he just gave up, so material is still technically equal. Rook to e2 check, king f5, a few checks, king to e6. Obviously, Carlsen is just threatening to take the pawn with check, so bishop to c8 kicks the king away. The king goes to e5, and now f7. Getting dangerously close to that queening square, and both players are low on time, certainly under 3 minutes. King to d6, bishop to a6. At the very least, he wants to put this bishop on this square so it can permanently defend the f-pawn. King to e7, bishop to c4, and now rook to f6 check. King to g5, and there are a few maneuvers, a few checks here. The rook goes back and forth. King to h5. And here Magnus took a moment, and he calculated the implications of giving up his rook. He accepted 2 rooks. He's given back 1. Will he give back his second rook? And he calculated, is this king and pawn endgame a draw or not? And he decided after calculating that it was. So he played rook takes f7. He gives the exchange back. Now he's down a pawn. Obviously it's 2-1. Let's see if he calculated correctly. King g5, the kings race back towards the queenside pawns. King to d5, king d2, king d4, king c2, king d5, king d3. And after dancing a little bit, it becomes very clear that Magnus Carlsen had calculated correctly. The problem is, white can always exchange the b pawn for the a pawn, but he will always be left with a rook pawn, which is a draw. After king d5, Pragg plays b4. Exchanging those pawns off, but now Magnus just races his king back. And here Pragg, knowing that it's a textbook draw, just plays a6 check. I mean, if he goes king to b5, the king just goes to a8 and stays in the corner. So he plays a6 check, king takes a6, and thus ended an amazing game. Some of the moves they made in this time control really boggles the mind. What talent, you know, and even after this great game, there are still some great chess games that you're missing out on. And to fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you want to look at is this game right here, also by Magnus Carlsen. Truly phenomenal. See you again soon.